Thank you for joining in on another episode of Youth Ministry 6.3. This episode I think you'll really enjoy. Not that you don't enjoy the other ones, but this one I think is really important because so often we're not focused on what we need to be focused on as youth ministers, as leaders, as mentors. And this series, this episode is on evangelism, missional living, if you might want to use that term. Charles Spurgeon once said, someone asked, will the heathen who have never heard the gospel be saved? It is more a question with me whether we who have the gospel and fail to give it to those who have not can be saved. So that has always stuck with me, that quote with Spurgeon. And it's a good quote, and there's others that you could share as well, but of course the Great Commission calls us into leading people to be disciples, and then in turn leading them to lead others in being disciples as well. And so Alvin Reid from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary has written a ton of books is on this episode, and we're talking about missional living, evangelism, and what it means to do those, and how us youth ministers can be more evangelistic and help our students be the same. Enjoy this, and don't forget to comment. Don't forget to give me some feedback, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you. This is Robbie McKenzie, Youth Ministry 6.3. Comes from Nehemiah 6:3. Says, "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down." I have with me Dr. Alvin Reid. Dr. Reid is a professor there at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I believe it's Wake Forest, North Carolina.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Just outside Raleigh.
Okay, good deal. Good deal. I thought that was right. Doc Reid's written a lot of books. A couple I've read. The two I've read is one that I got here, Raising the Bar, very formative when I started youth ministry back in 2004, and then another that I read here recently was The Convergent Church. Mm-hmm. And so enjoy a lot that you do, and it's got a great website there, alvinreid.com. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about evangelism today, and just want to say thank you so much for being on, Dr. Reid.
Yes, sir. Glad to be with you.
First of all, there's this term that gets thrown around a lot, and sometimes, when I talk to some church members of mine about it, they had no clue, they've never heard it, and a term maybe that you can unpack for us. Break down that term missional for us and what that term means.
Yeah, I really have embraced that term missional. The last two books I've written have missional in the title. I just finished a course this semester. I actually teach two classes now with the word in the title, but it's important we understand what it means. Missional is simply the adjectival form of the word mission. It's missions as a modifier. And a lot of times we've turned church, which is a noun, into an adjective. We have church music and church services. Church is really a noun, but missions as an adjective I think fits. So to be missional means I think like a missionary. I take the posture of a missionary. It's kind of arisen, it's a long story of how it arose kind of out of the writings of Leslie Newbegin and some other organizations, but essentially it's a recognition, and certainly this is true from my perspective, that we live in a foreign mission field now. The United States of America is the fourth largest unsaved nation in the world. Monday, I took a group of students out just in a community sharing the gospel in North Raleigh. We met people from about 6 different nations in an hour and a half.
Wow.
And so the whole world is in the cities. The whole world is all around us. The first person we talked to was a Muslim from India, and this is in the suburbs of Raleigh.
Wow.
And so missional simply means to think like and to live like a missionary.
Okay, so in that aspect, it's kind of the same as evangelism in a way that you're thinking like a missionary. It's not evangelism per se, but it puts the emphasis on the missionary. Is that right?
Yeah. Evangelize without being missional. You can have an event and put the gospel out there. You can go door to door, and that's what we were doing Monday. But that doesn't mean you're missional. You can't really be missional without being evangelistic, but you can be evangelistic in ways that are not necessarily missional.
Okay.
And so what I'm arguing and others are arguing is that we have to make a shift in America in a culture where far less people have a biblical mind, understand the biblical message, And so we have to think like a missionary would going overseas, who has to understand a culture and a language. With the rise of the internet, the digital generation, this millennial generation is a different breed, a different tribe than 40 years ago, 30 years ago. I've often said that if the 1950s come back, a lot of our churches are going to be ready, but they're not coming back.
Right.
And the 1950s was a great decade. I was born in 59, but this is 2011, and we think differently, not about the gospel. The gospel doesn't change, but how we communicate the gospel is different.
Absolutely. Something that we've talked about here in our context is and you've heard it. It's nothing new, but the idea of relational evangelism and just having relationships. What are some positives and negatives to that approach? And I frame that from this because I talked with a guy and he said this, Doc. He said, you got to develop relationships, and really evangelism happens from relationships, of which I agree. But then I thought at some point the relationships has to move towards discipleship and teaching and so forth. So what do you think about that?
Well, when I was younger, relational evangelism essentially meant get to build relationships with people and never talk to them about Jesus.
Right.
I think we're getting better in our day. I think the idea of being missional is helpful in that missional is a little more intentional, or it should be. And I do think it's true that now more and more people that don't know Christ are going to be reached out of relationships.
Sure.
At the same time, about 2 months ago, I led a young lady to Christ who is from up north, never been in an evangelical church in her life until the Sunday before she came to our church.
Wow.
That's another long story, but the first time I sat down with her, went through the gospel with her, she trusted Christ, and
That's
she's
awesome.
been changed by the gospel. So, the danger is when you get to where, well, I can't really share the gospel until I've got to know him for 6 months. There comes a certain point where, the problem is lost people are more amazed at our silence than they are offended at our message. Right. And after a while, if we don't share it, what we're saying to them is it's not important.
That's true.
So that's the danger.
Yep. Something else, speaking of different ways of evangelism, you've heard a lot and probably have spoken a lot about attractional models of evangelism. And I struggle with this, Doc, just to let you know, because sometimes it seems like churches are all they're doing is trying to attract people, and there's no discipleship. But on other, I don't want to judge some, because some are actually attracting them and they're also doing the discipleship. So what do you think about attractional evangelism, and how does that differ, or maybe similar in some respects, to missional churches?
Well, in my evangelism handbook, my latest book, I have a chapter on paradigm shifts, and I talk about how we've got to move from attractional to missional. But in that case, it's really both and. It's just a shift in emphasis. Attractional evangelism will always be effective. Last night, I was in a small town north of Greensboro, North Carolina, and spoke to a large group. Well, I say a large, for one church in that area, probably 100 or more young people. And we had, I'm guessing, more than 20 come to Christ.
Wow. In
an attractional event where they invited their friends. I came in and shared the gospel. So it's not like we need to stop doing those.
Right.
But the problem is that builds a culture that actually cuts against being missional, where all you have to do is 2 or 3 times a year invite people to an event and you're good in terms of evangelism. No. That needs to be part of a larger missional strategy. Jesus said in John 1, come and see.
Yep.
In John 20:21, he said, as the Father sent me, so send I you. So it's really both and. But again, in our context, if you go to some places in the world, you're not going to put up a tent and have a crowd. You're going to have to find other ways to share the gospel. And so I would just say that we need to be more missional while not losing the attractional.
Very good. Something, and I'm stepping back a little bit. At the basis, say I want to learn how to be more missional. I want to learn how to share the gospel with those who are lost. What advice would you give me?
Well, I think it's important to read well. I think you start actually not with new books on being missional. I think you start with the book of Acts, and you see how they did it. You read the Gospels and see how Jesus, there are over 40 encounters of Jesus, and see how Jesus communicated with others. personal encounters and how he interacted with people. I think it starts, however, even before that, with really understanding the gospel. And one of the things that's really encouraging me right now is there's kind of a movement in the church to really understand the greatness of the gospel. We've tended to make the gospel as brief and as tiny as we can. And we typically think of evangelism as sharing as little as we can, as briefly as we can, with people we hardly know.
Right.
Instead of seeing that the gospel changes everything. It affects everything in life. It affects marriage and economics and relationships and decisions. And seeing that the gospel's huge and shifts everything in our lives to just being a transaction that happens to get us out of hell into heaven.
Right. Doc Reid actually has a sort of expertise in both areas, not only in evangelism, but also he's done a lot with student ministry, and that's kind of what we framed these interviews from. And so, from, say, a lot of churches have, and mine included, we have what's called a mission program.
Yeah.
And so we have this mission program, and we put money into the mission program and support missionaries and different evangelistic programs. But moving beyond that, I'm not saying that's bad, but moving beyond that, how do we go from mission programs to being in our youth ministries having mission trips, which aren't bad again, but how do we go from having these mission trips and mission programs to actually being mission-minded people?
Well, what I've said in my student ministry class this semester again and again and again ad nauseum is we have to get the message of God and the mission of God. The message of God, the mission of God. We understand the greatness of the gospel, and then we understand, doesn't matter whether we're butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, doctors, lawyers, preachers, youth pastors, doesn't matter. If we're saved, we're missionaries.
Yes, sir.
And we're called, regardless of location or vocation, to be that. And if that becomes the culture, the DNA, the ethos of the church, then you can still do mission trips, and you should do mission trips, because we're called, every Great Commission passage in the Gospels and in Acts calls us to go to the nations.
Absolutely.
So I challenge churches everywhere I go, last night included, that don't let your teenagers finish high school without getting out of the country.
Right.
On mission trips. So I'm a huge fan of those. I was in Africa this summer. At the same time, they ought to be part of a larger process. I teach a class every fall with Jeff Levengood of Long Hollow Baptist Church in the Nashville area, tremendous guy. And he talks in this class we teach about how to make an incarnational ministry that actually uses events like mission trips and camps, but builds them as part of the problem. See, part of the problem is we've created mission committees in the church when the church, it's not, does the church have a mission? It's the mission has a church.
Yes, sir.
And so we ought to understand that everything we're about ought to be about the mission. And out of that, you can still have committees and programs that look at specific aspects of that, but the compartmentalization that we've had for a long time, my hand is massive. Sorry, but the compartmentalization that we have is crazy. I mean, it's ridiculous, and we need to move away from that. So a mission trip should never be separate from the local church's mission. So that's why I tell our students, you ought to go to the nations every year, you ought to go to a major city, and you ought to do a mission trip to your own community every year. And our church does that. We go to about 10 countries a year. We're taking the ministry I work with, our young professionals, to Ukraine in the spring. But we also do a trip to our community, and we also try to breed that mindset every day and every week in the community as we live out our faith.
That's awesome. Last question. You talked to, at least alluded to, using Scripture, of course, as the number one way to be more mission-minded, and we can't emphasize that enough. Scripture, prayer, and all that. But what are some other resources? And you alluded to your evangelism handbook as well. What are some other resources that will help us, youth ministries, youth ministers, churches, to be more mission-minded?
Yeah. I heard this long ago. It's been popularized a lot by Student Leadership University, but who you become is based on the books you read, the people you meet, and the places you go.
Right.
And I think that's especially true if you start with meeting Jesus, going to the cross, and reading His Word. But built on that foundation, it is really important the books you read. And I think you ought to not just read books that are explicitly by believers. I think it's important to understand our culture. I read Seth Godin, and I read Malcolm Gladwell and others as well. But I think in terms of missional books, I think there are people you ought to read. Mark Driscoll's written a lot of things. Reform missions is a term he uses. Wow, when I start thinking about it, there's so many. Ed Stetzer, his writings, he's written several books about that. And I think it kind of depends on where you are, because for some, if you're one step ahead, you're a leader. If you're 10 steps ahead, you're an idiot. And if you're in a church that really doesn't understand missional, then get some other books that aren't all about that term, but are about the idea, like Comeback Churches by Ed Stetzer and Mike Dodson, and some books like that. The book for student ministers, the book Almost Christian by Kendra Creasy Dean, talks about the problem in the church that we've not been missional, we've not been gospel-centered, and we've taught more of a therapeutic, moralistic deism than really understanding the missions. And she talks about in that book how to move to a more missional mindset. So I think that's a really helpful book in that sense. I'm trying not to just promote my stuff, but I am working on a book for Nav Press that'll is due the publisher in spring, called Missional Students. And in this book, what I'm trying to say in this book is that what we ought to be doing in student ministry is creating a culture in our church where we work with parents and the local church to raise teenagers as they're teenagers to think like and live like missionaries. A 14-year-old can be a missionary. A 14-year-old in another country whose parents are missionaries, they're missionaries.
Right.
And so I think what we've got to do is take the momentum of this millennial generation, which is the largest generation of young people in history and the most unchurched, but also a generation that wants a cause. They want social justice. They want to be part of a movement. And take that enthusiasm and that motivation and channel that for the gospel's sake in that regard. So I would start with Dean, and I would read Comeback Churches. I would read some of the Alan Hirsch is somewhat provocative at times, but a good writer on missions and missional thinking. He has several books: Untamed, Shaping of Things to Come, things like that. But I think it's good to read books by people who push us and who may even do things methodologically differently than we might, but who help us think through concepts and kind of where we are in culture today.
That's awesome. Well, Doc, hang on. I appreciate you so much. This is another episode of Youth Ministry 6.3 with Alvin Reid. Thank you so much, Doc. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.